Good evening, everyone. One more live interview today, and it's now connection to London to British conductor Toby Purser, who has recently been given a position of head of conducting at Royal College of Music. And I'm just waiting for Toby to join the live so that he connects.
Добрый вечер.
Good evening once again. Добрый вечер. Well, we could enjoy a conversation in Russian, but that might bring some of
Definitely
our
better in
visitors
English.
to a dead stop. So we'll continue in English. And as always, like I've noticed that my first question is kind of always the same. It then goes into different directions, but I always, I'm always interested in the source of actually why is the music chosen by people that I talk to? I mean, you could become anything in this world, a writer, whatever, a teacher, a builder, a traveler. Why? How do you discover this affinity and this necessity to be a professional?
That's such a good question. And
music.
The answer is in so many different layers. I mean, to begin with, probably one of my first memories was music. So when I was about 3 years old or something and going to kindergarten, I was absolutely obsessed by the lady who used to come to play piano for us to learn songs. And I went home afterwards and I used to say to my mother, "Oh, I've just learned the most amazing song," and I would sing it to them. But at the end of term, my parents went to talk to the teachers and they said, "Oh, well, Toby's not very good at music. We don't think he's interested." And he said, and my mother said, "Well, that's crazy. He comes home every week and sings us the songs." And what it was that I was remembering all the songs and I was learning them I wasn't interested in singing them with all the other children, but I was absolutely obsessed with this amazing lady playing the piano and the amazing sounds which were coming out. And
so basically,
I think so. And and that lady became my first piano teacher as well. So there's a nice kind of connection. And I've always thought that there's something quite revealing about this story. Actually, it's only now that I think about it that it makes more sense, which was that I kind of enjoyed being the person who was creating the music rather than necessarily being one of the singers. Even though I loved playing in orchestras and things like that, my passions were always the piano and conducting. And it's interesting, I think, the way that our brains function, that I was able to soak up the song which the other children were being taught and repeat it. And strangely, that my first teachers didn't realize that I was passionate about music, which also makes you realize how important it is to have the right teachers, the right moment, the right opportunity. And at that particular moment, thankfully, my mother spotted how passionate I was about the music. And there were other things which happened, of course, which made my parents realize that music was my thing. Probably my second memory was they had a recording of the New World Symphony of Dvorak, conducted by Giulini. And I remember the third movement used to make, the scherzo used to make me just cry my eyes out because it was so scary. But then we'd get to the last movement and I would be kind of leaping around the room and waving my arms around. I remember my mother coming in saying, "Oh, you're a conductor." And I was only about 4. And I, of course, was like, no, because I didn't want I was too embarrassed, jumping around. But I think from early on, this kind of physical relationship to music was very important to me. It was a kind of natural reaction to the music for me. And then much later on, and from then on, piano, I thought I was going to be a pianist. But I was lucky enough, age 16, to start studying conducting because at school, we had to do something called, it was kind of like a community service. So we had to do something to help the community. And I chose to do gardening because I actually love gardening. And my piano teacher went berserk and said, no, you can't do gardening, it will ruin your wrists. So I had to go to the person who organized these activities and say, I can't do gardening, what else can I do? And he said, well, actually there's a retired teacher who wants somebody to go and visit him once a week for just the conversation and company. So I got on my bicycle. This wouldn't be allowed now, of course, but then it was allowed. I got on my bicycle, went off to this man's house, and he said, what are you reading right now? I said, I'm reading a book by Sir Adrian Boult called The Point of the Stick. And his eyes lit up, and he said, Sir Adrian was my teacher, and if you bring a baton next week, I'll start teaching you how to conduct. So it all started by accident. And I was lucky enough to be able to get friends together. I was at a very musical school, and so I could put together an orchestra. And that was when my passion was born. That's when I realized that I loved conducting more than playing the piano, more than playing the cello. And that was what I wanted to do. And after that, it's kind of like anybody else really, as you decide what you're going to do and you believe in it totally. And there have been many moments when I thought, is this the right thing for me to do? Am I good enough? But thankfully I kept going, and I'm pleased I kept going.
If you compare what you can communicate with piano playing and what you can communicate with conducting, is there a big abyss, or is there a similarity?
There's one similarity, which is, I think that when you play the piano, you create an entire musical universe. So all you need is yourself and a piano, and you don't need anybody else apart from the composer. And with conducting in the same way, when I look at a piece of music, I hear it all in my head, and so I don't need any. In a sense, at that moment in time, I don't need anybody else. But of course, the reality is that without an orchestra, without other people, conductors are nothing. I mean, we are useless. We have no purpose. Which is one of the things which is so difficult about now, you know, when we're in lockdown. I mean, you know, what is our purpose in life if we don't have orchestras to conduct? And so the big difference for me is psychological, that when I'm playing the piano, you can be inspired in a moment. You can react at whenever you want to an idea or to a change of idea, even, or so if you're accompanying somebody, you can be so flexible because you are in that moment of time, and your body and your brain are so connected. When you're conducting, you're preparing an orchestra for what is about to happen, so you have to be thinking much further ahead. And so in a sense, you need the orchestra to be able to react with the same speed as a pianist can when they're on their own. But as a conductor, if you like with the orchestra only at the moment they feel the music, it's too late then to encourage them or allow them to understand what you want. Does that make sense? I'm not explaining myself that clearly. So I mean, so because as conductors, we're preparing the orchestra for what is about to happen. So it's like breathing in. The way we breathe in tells the orchestra the way in which they're going to play afterwards. But if you try to show something at the moment when they're already playing, it's too late to change what they're going to do. So psychologically, we're always much further ahead than you are when you play the piano.
So basically, with each moment, you can't really change. At certain point, you can't really change what the orchestra does because it's already in the flow of making something happen. You have to change some maybe future thing, but you really can't change what's happening at the moment, right?
But by the way you conduct, you allow sometimes, especially if you're accompanying, a certain level of flexibility. And so for example, I'm not. There are some conductors or some people who think that conducting is dictating, that you say, this is the way you play and you will play it my way. That's not my truth. My truth is that you share a belief which also enables everyone who is playing to feel able to give their own personality. And everyone in the orchestra is a soloist, and an orchestra will play best when you allow all of the talent within the orchestra to be able to express itself. And of course, a bit like a theatre director, you have some of the best actors in the world in one production. They're not going to speak like the director. They're going to speak like themselves, or the way they understand the role. But within the concept that the director has brought to the theatre, it's a bit like the same in opera. And I feel as a conductor, you're doing so many things at the same time, but one of them is to allow flexibility, and flexibility comes through listening. And so the greatest conductors are the ones who I think enable an orchestra to listen to each other like a chamber orchestra, like a chamber musician. So if you have, I mentioned about playing the piano and accompanying a violinist, for example, or a singer, and you feel like you're connected like this, and either of you can do anything and the other will react without even thinking about it. It's like you're living together. And with the great string quartet, it's the same. They breathe like one being. A great orchestra should be able to do the same, and that can be encouraged by the way you conduct. So if as simple as something, if I don't want to dictate, let's imagine there's an oboe solo. You've got 100 people in your orchestra, and there's an oboe playing, and at one moment you want that oboist, you want everyone to listen to that oboe player. So you might show a gesture, whatever it is, just something just to show that the ear needs to be directed to that oboe player. And then the oboe player can do whatever they want, but still connected to you. So you're still connected, and then they're never going to do anything which is unmusical. But by the way you listen to them, you enable the orchestra to listen to them as well, which means that you can still react instantaneously. Same with accompanying a concerto. You have a soloist, you don't know what the soloist is going to do, but you have to allow every possibility. And there are technical ways you can do that, which maybe I won't get into right now, but there are ways of, you want to make sure you don't commit to something before you've allowed space to be certain what the soloist is going to do. So in effect, you're encouraging the orchestra to lead with their ears more than their eyes.
But isn't then there a certain unfairness that in what you're describing, the conductor's work only makes sense when it is when it is channeled through the work of the whole orchestra, while then sort of all the laurels go to a personality? Like we don't think of Bernstein with the orchestra, or say Stokowski with the Philadelphia Orchestra. We think of them as individuals, while you described it as always an co-independent, mutually connected process. Why do you think we tend to separate the work
You're
of
so
these
right,
two
and it's so wrong.
entities,
I mean,
conductor and orchestra?
if you put Bernstein in, if Bernstein had only conducted his local amateur orchestra, we wouldn't have heard of him. He might have been a huge success with his amateur orchestra, but we wouldn't have heard of him. And on the one hand, we all know about the great orchestras. We know the St. Petersburg Philharmonic, the Berlin Philharmonic, Vienna Philharmonic, Chicago, New York, all of these orchestras. We know they're the great orchestras, and we don't necessarily think of them hand in hand with a conductor. I mean, the exception would be Mravinsky with St. Petersburg, Karajan with Berlin, because he kind of, his was the ultimate success story with an orchestra. But think of Simon Rattle with Berlin. We don't think of Simon Rattle and the Berlin Philharmonic. We kind of think of Simon Rattle as this great conductor who works with the London Symphony Orchestra, with the success he had with the City of Birmingham Symphony Orchestra. So I think what we do is most conductors don't stay with one orchestra for life. And to be honest, that would be unhealthy for the orchestra. I mean, every orchestra needs change. I mean, after about 10 years, and this is a huge generalization, but generally after about 10 years, you need something new. And so I think that's probably why conductors, it's not, I mean, you're right. Ormandy with the Philadelphia is a great example, you know, for example, but we think of Ormandy and his work in general, which includes his work with the Philadelphia Orchestra. So I do think that conductors are the sort of, I don't know, think of the word, the hero worship is wrong, because ultimately without an orchestra, as we said right at the beginning, you know, without an orchestra, we're nothing. And, you know, we're only able to conduct at our best when we have an orchestra which is wonderful, which can react to ideas. And actually, it's not a matter of them, you know, reproducing our ideas. It's a matter of them having amazing ideas, which we as conductors then can bring together into a wonderful whole.
Well, the one thing I was always wondering, how do you develop multi-channeled thinking that allows you to listen to everything, to listen to particular groups of instruments, and to cue that or that performer at the same time?
First of all, you have to know the score so well. And what do I mean by knowing the score? It's a lot more than knowing what the notes are. It's having it in your heart, in your blood, so that you don't have to be thinking what's happening next or what should I be listening to. You know so deeply. And that allows you to be totally open, because you're not worrying about what you do or don't know. You're just open, and you know what to listen to. So because you know it so well, it's so integrated into your body, into your mind, that you are able to hear everything because you know what to listen to. That's the first thing. But the question of how you divide your mind or your listening during a rehearsal, for example, is trickier. And it comes with experience and a lot of practice. So, for example, the first time most people stand in front of an orchestra, and certainly, and for me still, the first time I stand in front of a new orchestra, it takes a while to be able to, everything sounds blurred because you haven't yet quite understood the way they play, the way the sound works, what the acoustic is like. And eventually, with more and more experience and practice, it gets easier. But yeah, the first time you stand in front of an orchestra, it's just like, nothing is clear. It's like being in front of a fog, and you can't find any clarity. I don't know what to listen to. And of course, professional orchestras also play behind the beat or behind, and so that also takes a lot of getting used to if it's not something you've experienced before. If you've been working with youth orchestras or student orchestras or amateur orchestras, they play kind of closer to our beat, which makes it, you know, more difficult when we finally have a professional orchestra in front of us. So I realize I'm moving away from your question. So when you're in a rehearsal, there are kind of three things. I think there are three things. It's going to be like the Monty Python sketch where it suddenly goes from 3 to 4 to 5. But I think there are three things. So first of all, you need to know what's about to happen. Then you need to know what is happening. No, this is not right. This doesn't work like this. So let's imagine you're in the present. You hear what has happened. You need to know whether you liked it or not. And if so, if you didn't like it, how to fix it. And at the same time, you need already to be listening to what is happening after that and what's about to happen. So there are various things you need to be aware of at the same time. The most important thing is this question of knowing what's about to happen, then hearing it, and asking yourself the question, do I like it or don't I like it? How can I make it better? And then knowing, then obviously knowing how to fix it is kind of really important.
Mm-hmm. Well, now I really want to ask you, how come you went to Russia, and could you describe this uh, a mythical personality of Ilya Musin, who I think has been mentoring so many people, because he also went to Finland, I think, to do master classes. So even the Finnish School of Conducting, like Hannu Lintu is also his student. So I was
With
wondering if you
pleasure.
could
I mean,
tell us about your Russian studies.
my time living in St. Petersburg was the most life-changing year of my life. Ilya Musin was just the most heavenly person. He was like the great grandfather you wish you had. You know, he was 94 years old when I studied with him, and the reason I studied with him, first of all, was my teacher until that point, and also, actually, I have to be honest, he carried on as my mentor after I studied with Musin, was one of the great British conductors called George Hurst, and he taught pretty much most of the British conductors at some point. And after I'd been with him for 5 years, he said, "You've got to go and study with Musin. There's no one better." And Musin was in London when he was 92 for his debut, his London debut. And he was giving a masterclass at the Royal Academy of Music. So the night before the masterclass, he was giving a concert with the Royal Philharmonic at the Barbican. And I was at university, I was at Oxford at the time. And so I went up to London and saw this wonderful, elegant man conducting Mozart with such emotion and belief, and Rimsky-Korsakov, Capriccio Espagnol, and suddenly he transformed from this 92-year-old into a kind of like Spanish 25-year-old. You know, it was just, you could see his whole body changing, and everything looked so beautiful. His hands were always just in the right place to tell, with full of character, and the orchestra played phenomenally. And I just went home thinking, wow, this man has the answer to all the things, everything which I'm struggling with at the moment. I feel that this man can help me with. So I went back to London again the next day and managed to see his conducting masterclass at the Royal Academy, and went up to his assistant afterwards and said, "Is there any possibility I could audition for Maestro Musin before he returns to Russia?" And sadly, he was returning that night. So he said, "Don't worry, here's my email me and come to St. Petersburg and audition there." So 3 months later, thanks to the generosity of my parents, I was able to fly to St. Petersburg. And I had a couple of friends already in his class, so that really helped. So my friends were able to introduce me. I didn't speak any Russian at that time, apart from passport and "Я студент," and so I just about got through security, and my friend met me on the other side, and took me to meet Musin. I auditioned for Musin, and he gave me a 15-minute lesson, which just changed my life. And I thought, and for that 15 minutes, I learned so much about connection to the sound, always showing the meaning of the music. I mean, very important. If I hate to use the word rules, but if there were any rules for Musin, they were about always showing the character and the meaning of the music, and being connected to the sound. And right away, I understood that. I went back to the UK, and then I came back the following September to begin my studies with him. And he looked at me and said, "Who are you?" And he'd forgotten that I had auditioned for him, so I had to do another audition. And thankfully I was accepted for a second time. And so I spent a year there, and a second year going backwards and forwards. And with 3 times a week, he would have classes with piano all afternoon, and twice a week there would be sessions with orchestra. And he knew everything totally from memory, or from heart and from memory. I never looked at the score, and you would conduct whatever you were working on, with two pianos. The pianists were phenomenal because they just played exactly like an orchestra would play. So if you forgot to look at the double basses for an important pizzicato, they didn't play the pizzicato. Or, you know, they really knew how to play like an orchestra. And the thing I really learned from Musin, I mean, as an Englishman, you can imagine, you know, we have the reputation of being very shy and polite and a little bit keeping our feelings to ourselves. And suddenly I arrived in St. Petersburg, you know, sort of having been at Oxford for 3 years, you know, again, the quintessential English experience. And suddenly I'm living in a student hostel. I'm, you know, traveling to the conservatoire on the amazingly beautiful metro, walking through the snow.
Is it hostel? Is it the one on Padina Street,
what
right?
was it called?
No?
I can't remember.
Apachinina.
Because I only spent the first, have to be honest, I
Well,
spent 3
that's
months
just
there, and then I found myself a flat, my own flat, near the conservatoire, which was really very lucky. I wish I could remember the name of even the tube station. Anyway, there's probably somebody watching who is studying with me who can post in the group chat. So with Musin, it was just, it kind of totally I don't know, released me. That it was always, you know, you had to understand the meaning of the music and to show the feeling of the music. It was great, and of course, just to study Shostakovich with him when he had been a childhood friend of Shostakovich, and he used to tell the story about not only when they were in the conservatoire together and Musin played the sketches of the First Symphony with on I think piano and two pianos or piano and a string quartet. I can't quite remember, but he told the story about being there, but also sitting next to Shostakovich on the tram, and Shostakovich was scribbling away on a piece of paper, and he showed it to Musin, and it was dim ba 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 bim ba dum ba dum ba dee da, and Shostakovich said, "What did you think of that?" And Musin said, "Oh, nichivo." And then that was the main theme from the first movement of the First Symphony. And so Musin would you know just tell the stories about the first movement, which is about the Petrushka, you know, that is the, you know, is the and then the second theme is the ballerina, also the puppet doll, you know, and things which you can't get from books and you can't get anywhere else. It's just amazing tradition. And the other thing is that when he was teaching you Tchaikovsky or Rachmaninoff or Rimsky-Korsakov, you know that he was handing on a tradition which had been passed to him by his teachers, who probably got it from Tchaikovsky.
Well, the good thing about it that we have more time, because usually it's limited, and now we have kind of can restart now again. So that's good. But I wanted to ask you, he is known, Musin, for the technique. Everybody mentions that he was very attentive to the actual technique of the conductor. Did you sort of copy it from him? Did he ask to copy him, or did he allow everyone to have his or her technique?
Yes, he was very strict about certain technical rules, but it's also the sign of a great teacher that everyone who studied with Musin looks different. So the danger with any big personality such as Musin was is that you copy him exactly, and you know what works for one person for a 92-year-old does not necessarily work for a 22-year-old. So when I came back to London, it's true that I looked like a 92-year-old with arthritis, and I had to spend the next, you know, 3 years. I went to the Royal Academy after that, and you know, trying to work out and make sense of what I learned from Musin and what I learned from George Hurst before that in the UK, and also how to adapt what I learned with Musin to British orchestras, for example, see whether I needed to change things. So there were various principles which he taught, and at the beginning you needed to copy them in order to understand them. So the whole thing of picking up sound, I don't know if I can show on this, but you always picked up the sound from underneath and transferred it. And we would spend hours, all of us, standing in front of mirrors in our rooms, just making sure we could do a perfect circle with our wrists without any shaking, but absolutely smooth. And all these things just to make sure that everything was working properly and that you could really, touch the sound and pick it up. And pick up the sound was one of his crucial things. He didn't ever allow you to do a downward movement because that stopped the sound. You always needed, music's always traveling, therefore the sound should also be traveling. He didn't like sideways movements like this because, again, he felt you couldn't control where that beat stopped. And all of us have kind of taken those principles and made them our own. I mean, you can have as extreme examples as Gergiev, who underneath his way of doing things is actually sorry, is that way around? Is actually the Musin circular motions. If you remove the finger movements, you kind of have this circular thing here, and it's all connected to this feeling of sound always being continual, the kind of circle.
And actually, I think Gergiev even moves his body as if he is also part of the sound, I think. Yeah?
That's right. Exactly. And also, Gergiev hardly he doesn't have to say anything. He changes the sound of the orchestra because this kind of dynamic chemistry he has, and also because of the way he conducts, which kind of emits a kind of electricity. It needs a really good orchestra which can listen to one another, which takes us back to what we were talking about right at the beginning about great conducting, enabling an orchestra to listen to one another. And that's something which is essential with Gergiev's conducting, because it's so much about the orchestra taking responsibility for listening, and what he gives is something on a whole different level of musical expression. And then you have people like Temir Khanov, who has the most beautiful technique in the world. I mean, so elegant, and that's very pure Musin. And Bichkov, again, that's very close to the pure Musin technique, of course, with his own character. But it's fascinating seeing all these different students of Musin and the way they've adapted the technique for their own personalities.
Well, as we have slightly more time, I will indulge myself into asking, how was your relationship with St. Petersburg developing?
You mean while I was there?
Yeah, like the
while
city,
I was there.
Because our cities, sort of, we have this kind of notion that everyone has its own connection with the city, and it's usually love or hate, or some madness and passion, whatever, or a melancholy, like nobody is left neutral when one is here.
Yeah. Oh, you're so right. I adore St. Petersburg. I mean, it's such an emotional city. I mean, my favorite opera is Eugene Onegin, Yevgeny Onegin. And so, to be in St. Petersburg with that music, walking along and of course I read Dostoevsky while I was in St. Petersburg. So you read Crime and Punishment and you walk along, the canals and then you think about what happened in the revolution. I mean, the history is just so inspiring. And I almost don't know where to start, because it was like stepping into another universe for me. First of all, with the fact that I had such freedom, having come from being at university and suddenly being in a country far away from home, and being immersed in such a rich culture, being able to go to the Mariinsky every night, because as students it was possible. Germany is great for this too, and so is Austria, and I'm sure other countries as well. But in Britain, only recently has it started become more possible for young people and students to go and see the opera for very little money. But it used to be, you know, it's so expensive that how do you possibly get young people inspired and loving opera and ballet for that matter? So, I mean, I had sort of one rule, which was that at least once a week I would go to the Hermitage and explore just the greatest art collection you can imagine. And not just art, I mean, just the furniture, the rooms, I mean, everything you can imagine. I had amazing friends in St. Petersburg, not only my British colleagues, many of whom have obviously gone on to great careers as well. Alexander Walker, for example, who returns to Russia very often. But also of course, Stuart Stratford, who is now music director of the Scottish Opera. But you know, the Russian hospitality is something no British person has ever experienced before, unless they've come to Russia. And it's just so humbling, because at that time, most Russian families I knew had to work, and I'm sure it's still very difficult for a lot of people now, but people would I knew the most amazing lady who had to do 3 jobs just to pay the basic bills. You know, she was a university lecturer, she was doing translating, and also like a city guide and things, just to pay her basic bills. And I remember going for dinner at her house with her daughter, and she had just laid on a feast. And you just think, how is that possible? You know, and it makes me so ashamed as an Englishman, that when I think about the way we kind of measure out our hospitality sometimes, you know, is it, well, do you want 1 sausage or 2? You know,
or like 5 p.m. hospitality and 7 p.m. hospitality.
Yeah. And of course, I learned how to drink. I learned how to drink vodka as well. Of course, that was an important part of my education.
Okay, let's go back to music. Well, my next logical question is it because of the Mariinsky? Well, I'm joking, but at which point you decided to specialize in the opera, and is there such a specialization in your life?
I came to opera later, actually. I loved opera. When I was 18 years old, I spent a year living in Vienna, and I went to the opera pretty much every night. And although I'd been to opera before that, this was the first time I could go kind of every other night. And then the next time I could do that was when I came to St. Petersburg. I think I soaked up the repertoire. I soaked up especially the Russian repertoire, which wasn't something we heard much in Britain. You know, all the Mussorgsky operas, the Tchaikovsky operas, the ones which, you know, like Mazeppa, which are not really done very often in Europe, for example. And I don't think at that point I saw myself as an operatic conductor. And when I went to music college, it was a course which specialized really in symphonic conducting. And to be honest, all of my conducting training until that point had been about symphonic conducting, and with Musin as well. You know, I didn't conduct opera for Musin. So when I was at the Royal Academy of Music, which is where I went after St. Petersburg, I started doing opera scenes, which is when the opera department was doing with student singers, you know, maybe a bit of Figaro, a bit of Rosenkavalier, whatever scene. And so I'd get to conduct that. And then I did quite a lot of piano playing for opera companies, because I was a good pianist still and a good sight reader. So I'd often play for auditions, play for rehearsals, but I still didn't see myself, I still wanted to be a symphonic conductor, because for me that was what all my training had been about. And then a couple of years after music college, somebody I had studied with was conducting Igrok by Prokofiev for Grange Park Opera, which is the Gambler for non-Russian speakers. And my friend, there was a week of rehearsals which he couldn't take. And so he requested that I be his assistant. And this is my first time working for an opera company, a professional opera company. And I loved it, but I thought it might have been a one-off. But fortunately, it went very well. And the next year, the company invited me back to be chorus master and assistant again for everything. And then that went well. So the following year, they gave me my own production with the young artists. So I conducted Rigoletto for the young artists of Grange Park Opera. And every year, they gave me another production. So that was really how I was lucky enough to get my feet into opera. And very quickly, I realized that even if I thought or had thought until that moment that I was a symphonic conductor, my heart was probably in the opera pit. And if I hadn't been a conductor, or if I hadn't been a musician, I think I would have wanted to have been a psychologist. And I think because of the psychology involved in opera and the fact that you're dealing with, you're dealing with drama, you're dealing with music and everything, telling a story and getting inside the personalities of these people on stage. It's a much more all-enveloping experience. So I've now reached the stage where I think I'm probably 50% symphonic, 50% opera. And it does change from time to time. There may be things happening in the future which I can't announce yet, which will give me more opera, but I'm hoping that there's going to be a serious collaboration with one of the Russian opera houses. So as soon as I have news on that, I'll let you know.
Well, I'm definitely, yes. Well, I wanted to ask, like, before we go into particular productions that you made, I wanted to ask you, what is then specific about opera conducting? And then we talked about multi-channel your attention, but here adds a completely new level of complexity, which is all the singers on stage. So where does your attention go then?
Well, there's one big advantage in opera, which is that you there's one big advantage in opera, which is probably that you may have had 5 or 6 weeks of rehearsal with the singers before you get into the theatre. So by the time you are with the orchestra, you have a very good idea of not only of the production, but what the singers need from you. Then you start rehearsing with the orchestra. And of course, I mean, there's a very famous letter by Carlos Kleiber, actually, where somebody wrote, Carlos Kleiber, who to my mind was the greatest conductor who ever lived. He never really taught conducting, but he wrote a letter to somebody who asked for advice on how she should, an American female woman conductor asked for advice on how she could build her career. And he wrote back saying, anyone can conduct a symphony, but start doing opera. When you do opera, then you need technique. And I think the reason for that is because what I mentioned right at the beginning of our interview about needing to allow flexibility is also totally true for opera, in that you never know quite, you have to be ready to react to an emotion on stage, a dramatic event, which is not something you can prepare for. It may be different every single night. Something may go wrong on stage. A singer may miss a cue. And so you kind of need to be ready to react to every situation. You've also got the fact that your orchestra's probably somewhere down that way, and your stage is up that way. And if you conduct as you would for a symphony orchestra, the stage probably won't be able to see you, and half the orchestra might not be able to see you. So you're having to adapt where you put your hands according to the pit, and according to what people need from you at different moments. So yes, it does require huge flexibility. But so long as you're listening to the singers, and so long as you're able to make the orchestra, normally the orchestra can hear the singers as well. When the orchestra can't hear the singers, then that's a whole different problem. But normally, if the orchestra can hear the singers, it's much easier to accompany.
Mm-hmm. I wanted you to tell maybe the audience who is not from Britain briefly, could you describe the landscape of operas? Because I've been working with, well, for me, I'm just sort of the normal attendee of Royal Opera House, say of Glyndebourne occasionally if I get the ticket. I went to Regent Park's opera, but the other operas, I have to admit, this scale smaller opera companies in Britain, it wasn't well known to me. So could you describe to me how they exist and say how their responsibilities are developed? Are they private ones? And
Yes, I'll talk about 4 companies, because there are 4 companies which I think are very different and maybe illustrate this point best. So you have the really grand ones. You've got like the Royal Opera House, English National Opera in London. Then you've got Scottish Opera, Welsh National Opera, which is based in Cardiff but travels around. I don't want to miss anybody important out, but those are the kind of like the big ones, and those ones get a significant subsidy from the government, a fraction compared to what opera houses get in Germany and more enlightened countries and like that. But nevertheless, they do have a government subsidy of sorts, not enough though. And then there's the summer opera house. We've got summer festivals, summer festival opera houses. And that's kind of something I think we're really famous for in Britain. So Glyndebourne is the most famous one, but there's also Garsington, Grange Park Opera, Grange Festival, Holland Park Opera, and those are just the ones kind of near and around London. There are lots of other ones like Iford Arts, and those are all privately funded. So they generally are a mixture of sponsorship from companies or individuals. So if you look at the program, you'll probably find there are pages and pages of individuals who have given money to support the festival, and in return they get invited to drinks parties and dinner with the artists, for example. Corporate sponsorship, obviously that's a whole another matter, and then the tickets tend to be very expensive as well, and that's because there's no public subsidy and opera is very expensive. So you think you're an orchestra of, let's say, 60 people, you've got a cast, you've got a chorus, you've got the director, you've got the designer, all the stage crew, so yeah, it's a big operation that costs a lot of money. So those are the summer opera festivals. Then you have smaller specialist companies. One company I work with called Opera della Luna, which I adore because they specialize in comic opera. Their director is a guy called Jeff Clark, who's a genius.
But I traced your thoughts. You were talking about Opera della Luna.
That's right. So Opera della Luna, which is a small, and you could call it, I hesitate to call it a fringe company, but fringe companies are ones which operate on a very small budget in small theaters, generally touring around the country, doing things for local audiences. I think that's a very special product. And then there are also community opera companies. So I work, for example, with New Sussex Opera, and that's an opera company, again, works on a tiny budget, is run by an army of volunteers who, they have other jobs or they're retired, but they volunteer to build sets and travel, transport things around to the rehearsals, to the venues. And you have a local chorus, so an amateur chorus, community chorus, who pay an annual subscription in order to take part. And then you have a professional cast of soloists, professional conductor, professional director, etc. So, and those are the kind of the main models which come to mind. So you have the community opera companies, the kind of fringe companies, then the summer festivals, and then the big or bigger government-supported professional companies.
So I presume your yearly schedule could actually be involving all of them, right? You could work
Yes.
at the Eno and then spend time with a New Sussex Opera, and also in summer do some summer festival opera, right?
Exactly. Yeah, that would be possible, and most conductors kind of do that. You know, they're guest conducting with lots of different companies.
Mm-hmm. But how come you've been asked to do the assistant conducting? Is it sort of how to say downshifting from the conductor's profession, or is it a new experience?
No, you know, I wish when I left music college I had known how important it was to be an assistant conductor, and
Mm-hmm.
I actually didn't know. I think I was a bit proud, and I thought that when I left music college that I would be able to go, that the phone would ring and I would immediately be conducting everywhere, and of course it didn't happen like that. Um, and I remember having amazing opportunities to make contact with famous conductors, and I didn't follow them up, and it was a mixture of shyness and also thinking, I don't want to be an assistant conductor. Why would I want to do that? And now I realize, and I tell every student conductor the same thing. It says, you know, use your contacts, you know, make contact with all the conductors you can and ask to assist, attend their rehearsals, and eventually when you build that, you get their trust, they might invite you to be an assistant conductor. And because you learn so much from assisting, you learn seeing somebody else making the mistakes and how they solve things and how they do things well. Mm-hmm. And that's the way you make contacts. That's the way you learn the way a professional conductor needs to operate, to work. And in a way, that's something which you can't learn at music college. And that's, you know, said in with even my position as, you know, head of conductor now at the Royal College, I'm the first to admit that the stuff you learn at college is only a fraction of what you need to know compared to what you learn when you're actually doing it, when you're actually out in the big world conducting. I don't want to say just professional orchestras, because it's not just about professional orchestras, but, you know, conducting in your own right.
If in an opera an assistant director has to know every move, do you, as an assistant conductor of an opera, also have to know every move of the conductor musically?
Yes and no. So there are some things which you need to do the same in order not to create a car crash. So mm-hmm. if the orchestra expects something to be conducted in a certain way, and I'm talking about really major things like, are you going to beat a particular aria in 2 or 4, for example? So you need to do basically the same. And there may be places where a singer expects a cue at a certain moment or expects you to come off a pause in a certain way. So there are things you need to do in the correct way. However, you're not a machine, and you know the principal conductor, the person you're assisting, is not going to conduct the same 2 nights running either. Every mm-hmm. night is different. So when you assist, you're mainly observing the production. You're observing the way the principal conductor approaches the music. There may be things you don't like. There may be things which the cast doesn't like. And let's imagine that at the end of 10 performances, there are going to be 2 which you conduct because the principal conductor is going away to do something else. Then you do have the possibility of making some discrete changes. So you could talk to the singer, say, look, do you mind? Can we go a bit faster here? You know, and they might say, yes, please, you know, or they might say, no, I don't want it changed. So there's always a conversation to be had. So what you wouldn't want to do is to suddenly jump in and conduct a show when you didn't know the production and you didn't know how what the orchestra was expecting. So that would be really dangerous. So it's knowing what the parameters are. It's knowing what the orchestra and the singers expect from you, but knowing that you have to be yourself. You know, as you have to be truthful to your own body, to your own way of conducting. And that's the only way you're going to get a really good performance. Because if you try to copy somebody else, it will never be an exciting performance.
I was going to ask, can you briefly describe, from all the variety of choices for repertoire, if you were responsible for the repertoire of the company, could you describe your deciding process, what to take in the season?
Gosh, it depends on the company. So you have to think about, it's very difficult for me to give you a precise answer because there are so many different kinds of opera company, and let me just give you maybe a very brief answer about the various categories. So the community opera, you're going to need to have enough chorus involvement that they're interested, but at the same time, not too much that it's too difficult for them. And likewise, you need to have a cast which is not too big, or else they won't be able to afford to pay that number of soloists. So that kind of becomes a deciding factor on the choice. Plus, to be honest, I don't think there's any point doing La Traviata or Madame Butterfly with a community opera company because they're done so much better than by other professional companies. Why would you want to go and hear one of those done badly? But there are some amazing other pieces which aren't done regularly. For example, so many forgotten works by Offenbach. I love Offenbach. I mean, comic genius. There are forgotten operettas by Johann Strauss. There are so many operas written by forgotten composers. British composer called Charles Villiers Stanford, C.V. Stanford. I did an opera by him 2 years ago called The Travelling Companion. And it's kind of like Britain's answer to Humperdinck's Hansel and Gretel. It's kind of like it's beautiful music and it's kind of unknown. And so I think you have to program imaginatively and with stuff which is going to help you to find an audience, because you need to have something which gets their imagination going as well and makes them want to come and see it. With fringe companies, it's always going to be something probably without chorus, or else where the chorus is rewritten to be taken by the principals, or sort of swallowed up into the principal parts. And again, with that, it's probably you're going to find a lot of contemporary opera, so trying out new pieces. Again, operetta, which can be done with a small number of people and with a small number of musicians. The summer festivals tend to have between 3 and 6 productions, and they'll be planned to balance one another. So you might, for example, have a Handel opera, a Mozart opera, and a Puccini, for example. So you have a kind of wide range of styles. With the big opera houses, then there's a balance. I mean, I can't give you an authoritative answer because my position at English National Opera was as the conducting fellow. So I was there as an assistant conductor and kind of learning the role of how to be a music director. And it's all about balance. It's about having a program which the audience is going to want to come to, and making sure that the company develops. So you need to have enough stuff for the chorus to be inspired. You need the orchestra to be able to show themselves at their best. Not too much of one thing, not too much of, and it's just getting the balance. I mean, if I was music director of a smaller opera house, the first thing I would need to know is the strengths, how good the orchestra is, how good the chorus is, and the resident ensemble, if there is one. So in Germany, in Russia, for example, you have an ensemble of singers who kind of are like employed full-time by the theatre. We don't have that in Britain. so generally speaking, the singers are employed on a production to production basis. So it's like by contract, which gives freedom. And it means you don't have, so if I don't have a Wotan, you just book one. Whereas I think, you have to work around the ensemble you have available in an opera house, which is, has its singers employed full time. And what's really interesting right now is how the opera houses develop after the lockdown starts to ease. And I don't know what the answers are, but I think in a sense, it's very exciting because we see all the opera houses now having to think really imaginatively. How can they fulfill their role in the community while still operating and having, being of a high enough artistic standard? And we're still totally locked down in the UK in performances, but in the Netherlands, in Germany, in Austria, there are performances starting to happen. Outdoors performances. A lovely friend of mine is involved in a theatre in Germany, and they were doing an outdoor performance this weekend, for example. And I think that's the way forward. While the weather is nice, when it starts changing, then we've got to hope that coronavirus is under control and we can get more people into the theatres. But meanwhile, I'm sort of thinking ahead to September, when I hope to be working with, as I mentioned, an opera house in Russia. And I'm thinking, well, what can we do which has a small orchestra, a small number of singers, which is artistically of the highest quality. And I've thought of a few ideas. I mean, there are obviously chamber operas like The Tone of the Screw by Benjamin Britten, which is for I think it's 12 instrumentalists in the pit. I'd have to count them up in my mind, but roughly 12 musicians. And then the cast is also very small, 6 people. Then there are even reduced orchestrations of the Wagner operas. You can even start thinking, well, there's no chorus in most of the Ring cycle. So there's no, so you could do that. You could do that. There are ways of being imaginative, although that's a very long piece of music. So
but you'll have to take the harps out of it, yeah?
Yes, well,
the 6 harps have to go.
You're definitely not going to have the 6 harps unless you can rewrite them and stick them somewhere up in the roof, which could be really quite beautiful. The harps coming from heaven. But there's a very good reduced orchestration by Jonathan Dove, who's a British composer, and he uses pianos, for example, in the ensemble, and that means you can still have the harp effects, but with piano. The other thing is doing short performances. Let's say you have for example, Il Trittico by Puccini is 3 short operas. And so if you've got to be in a situation where you can only have people in a room for a certain amount of time and then they have to leave, well, you just do a 1-hour opera and then everyone goes. And then you don't have to worry about the loos, what happens in the interval, the bars, all that it's just literally in and out. And that way you can do 3 repeats of that performance in one day. Same cast, same orchestra, and you can still get your audience. So I don't, as I said, I don't have my ideas fully thought through yet, but it's something I'm thinking about a lot. And the people who come out of the present crisis strongest are going to be the ones who have enough imagination to make a positive out of a difficult situation. It's not, I mean, for us to dream of going back to the way it was in January doesn't help anybody. I mean, of course we all want to go back to that eventually, but in a sense it's quite exciting that in the next 6 months, if we know we're going to be working with only small ensembles, then we can all be exploring this repertoire which has been done less than it probably should have been.
Yeah, I actually was thinking that now it's maybe time for me to write a book, not a general anthropology of music book, but how the world of music coped with the crisis and recovered after it. You know, it's going to be maybe a historical book if someone manages to write it. Well, I want you to talk about two of your productions that were Olivier, the traveling companion, the one that you have mentioned, and the Turn of the Screw that you also have mentioned at Eno. They are so different. One is the rediscovered opera that you also recorded. Well, at Eno, it's probably sort of more well, not conventional, but more big scale and with big audiences by a more well-known composer. But what were sort of the highest moments, the highest joys of doing them, and maybe the challenge also?
Well, let me talk about the Turn of the Screw first, because that was the climax of my time working at English National Opera, and it was I think it was the production I've most loved working on, and it's also a production which could be done now or very soon, because it's actually, we didn't do it at the Colosseum in the theatre. We did it outdoors in the Regent's Park open air theatre. So already you think, oh, this could work with coronavirus. As I said, the orchestra is very small and only a very small number of singers. Where it was really difficult is because we were outdoors. First of all, the sound had to be amplified. So you had a very big audience, but all outdoors. And the open air theatre is famous for doing musicals. So when you go and see a musical there, the levels of volume are really quite high. And right from the beginning, we were saying it needs to sound like you're in an opera house. It needs to sound natural. It mustn't sound amplified. And I have to say they did the most amazingly good job at that. It sounded as acoustic as was possible. And the other big difficulty was that you had your audience. I don't know how to show this on the screen, but you have your audience. Let's imagine you have your audience where my neck is, and you got the stage coming closer to the screen, and then I was then behind the stage. So instead of being between the audience and the stage, because of the way it's set out there, I, with the orchestra, had to be basically in a box behind the stage, which meant that I was only able to follow the singers or communicate with the singers through TV monitors dotted around in various places. And again, you know, the company was amazing. It was like, okay, where do you need monitors? And they just did whatever the singers and I needed. So no stone was left unturned. And sometimes there was eye contact between the singers and me because I was standing sideways on, which meant that I could see across the stage. I could see when they were breathing, which is the most useful thing for a conductor to see in a singer. It's really seeing when a singer breathes, which kind of really helps you. And so there was communication when needed, and we had enough time in rehearsal to work out where the moments were where they needed to absolutely just follow me, and the other moments where I was able to accompany them. So you know, there are lots of moments in Turn of the Screw which are like an aria, like there's a very beautiful aria for the governess very near the beginning, and you need to allow her absolute freedom. You know, she is the soloist at that moment and you're partnering her. There are other moments where the conductor is absolutely in charge, like the big ensemble, the moments where everybody's singing at the same moment. And those are the moments where you need to make sure everyone was able to see you on a monitor and make sure that we were absolutely together. It was, in the end, it was less difficult than I expected. And I was terrified when I started because I was thinking it would be almost impossible to do. And actually, I had been lucky because I had done some productions where I had to be conducting basically in a box behind the stage before. Long ago, the same company which gave me my first work as an opera conductor, which was Grange Park Opera, they take musicals into prisons. And for example, I did West Side Story in a prison, in Wandsworth Prison, and the band was behind the stage with me. So the only communication I had with the singers, and the singers were prisoners, was through a monitor, like a speaker I had in my ear so that I could hear them, and a camera. So I could see what was on stage on a TV screen in front of me, and then there were monitors around the front of the stage so that they could see what I was conducting. And in the rehearsal period, they got really used to knowing, okay, listen, I'm going to point at you there, and you're going to make sure you're seeing exactly there. And on those moments, they know that they've got to be with you. But there are other moments where you can hear them, so you can react to them, and you can be flexible. And basically, I always say this: you follow with your ears, not with your eyes. And the same applied to the turn of the screw. That you can be totally connected to somebody without seeing them. Obviously, it helps to see them, but you work out the moments where you need visual contact. So I think that was the big challenge. Really, was the fact that the setup was very different. We had the most wonderful soloists, and we had two different casts. So that was interesting. That because there were sometimes two performances per day, and it's a very taxing opera to sing, so you can't possibly do it, consecutive nights. The voice needs to rest. But because of the way the theatre operated, they needed performances every single night. So we had two casts. And that was interesting because I got used to having to adapt and conduct differently for different singers. So I would know that one, so that the housekeeper is called Mrs. Gross, for example. There's one Mrs. Gross who was, the most amazing, was so energetic and dynamic on stage. And another one who brought a more greater warmth and to the role. They were both fantastic. They both had a very different energy with the role. And so I think the orchestra and I enjoyed the fact that every single evening we'd say, who's singing tonight? And then we'd know we would play differently.
So basically, this opera taught you to be the monster of adaptation, because not only you had to adapt to a very unusual acting practice, but also to cast, right?
That's right. But there's a principle here, which is the same for everything you do. You can have the same orchestra, and you have a great rehearsal in the morning. Everyone is full of energy, and then they come back at 3 o'clock, and they're and it's impossible, and probably because they've had too much pasta or something. But it's like a different orchestra, or they can come in the next morning and they're very, very tired, and you realize it's because they had a concert the night before and they're absolutely exhausted. So you're always having to adapt. No orchestra is the same as another orchestra, and often the same orchestra is different moment to moment.
And this the traveling companion, well, I guess it was an event, right, for everybody, that you rediscovered this opera and recorded it.
Well, we were very lucky with this because there's a society called the Stanford Society, which basically exists to celebrate and promote the music of Stanford. And they came to the opera company with a proposal, which included some sponsorship for making the recording, which made it possible. Without that, the company would never have been able to do that opera. It would have been just too expensive. And it was a real joy discovering that piece of music, because I didn't know the music of Stanford apart from his choral music, and he was a wonderful writer of church music, of choral church music, and I didn't realize there were always operas as well as symphonic music. And apparently the Traveling Companion is his best opera. I don't know the other ones very well. I think there's one called The Critic, which is unfortunately doesn't have a chorus, so I can't do it with New Sussex Opera, but it's supposed to be his other kind of best opera. And the thing I was not happy about with that production was that the budget wasn't big enough to have a full-sized orchestra exactly as Stanford wrote. So we had to have the orchestra slightly reduced. And it means that there's not the warmth of sonority I think that score really needs. And I think the thing about that recording was that hopefully it will inspire some larger company to do a production with everything it deserves. And at least it gives people an idea of this wonderful music and you know how much character there is. It's really worth exploring. But it was difficult because I always felt, well, for one thing, we were having to make the reduced orchestration quite late in the day. So we were continually making changes. Even on the day of the recording, you know, we were still finding little mistakes. So so that was a difficult thing. And also just the fact that we'd never quite managed to get the, you know, the noble sonority which Stanford, I think, had in his mind.
Mm-hmm. Well, before we finish, well, let's finish with one big theme. Your position as the head of conducting at the Royal College of Music. What are new generation of conductors like? What legacy are you imbuing them with? Is it with this connect Musin and Shostakovich, or with something else that you yourself built and want to pass to them? And what are your visions of, is this generation different? Is it all modern and kind of into a new technology, or does it have something similar to like your generation or your colleagues? Like, what are your ideas about young people who want to conduct today?
So many questions. It's yes and no to all of them. So I'm going to start from the end. Actually, I think a conductor music has to be relevant to the present. You know, nobody wants music to be a museum, and so the new generation of conductors has to be aware of the present society and of their position within that position within the community. And by that, I don't just mean, you know, within where they live. I mean the position of a conductor in relation to orchestras, in relation to opera companies, and in relation to the communities we serve by doing performances. And that is always changing. So, you know, all conductors, whatever age, they have to embrace means of reaching out to as many people as possible and to using technology for that, so long as it doesn't hurt the music. And that's where I draw the line. So you asked me at the beginning about my heritage. And yes, I do think that's something very important, which I bring to my role. But I think a great conducting teacher is, well, I don't even know if there is such a thing as a great conducting teacher. I think that there are great people who enable people to learn. And we want every student to be the best version they can be of themselves. I don't want anybody to be like me. And I've made so many mistakes. You know, I want people to learn not to make the mistakes I made, for example, and hopefully to embrace the good things I have to offer and things I've learned from other great musicians and other great teachers. Mm-hmm. And I'm very proud, on the one hand, of my heritage. The fact that I was very close to George Hurst, who was the most influential musician on my life, and who studied with Pierre Monteux, and, you know, so he studied La Mer, Debussy, and The Rite of Spring with the man who premiered those pieces and knew Debussy and knew Stravinsky. So, you know, there's that wonderful continuity. And Monteux, I think he studied with somebody who studied with Wagner.
So you were saying about that guy who was connected to Pierre Monteux, right?
That's right. So George studied with Pierre Monteux, and you know, I'm very proud of what I learned from George, which I know it's something I believe. This is the thing, is what I learned from George. George wasn't perfect, And so there are lots of things he taught me which now I think, I'm not sure. I think that was maybe something really more of its time. And also he had, my God, he had a temperament. I mean, he would have huge tantrums, you know, and that's something he probably learned from Toscanini. And that's not something I would ever want a conductor to do now. You cannot behave like Toscanini now. You know, it's just not possible. And, you know, and there have been students of George Hurst who thought that was the way to treat an orchestra. So, you know, so you have to take the good things and the bad things and work out what are the things which really matter. And, you know, with Musin, this connection to sound, which is so important, and always communicating the meaning of the music, being the image of the music. You know, those are principles, as well as the way they taught me the music. I'm again going back to George. The idea, the thing I learned from George, which matters most to me, is a sense of organic, but I can't think of the right words for it. Kind of a structured, organic approach to symphonic music, which meant that there was always a sense that you had a flexible tempo, which was never about being wayward or being self-indulgent, but it's always in order to enable every phrase of music to have its correct nature. And I know that is always going to be subjective. You say, well, what is the nature of that phrase? But it's something Wagner writes about in his book on conducting, you know, that you have to have a flexible tempo rubato, which allows every phrase to attain its nature. And the way you do that imperceptibly, so hopefully the audience will never notice that the tempo is changing, but somehow everything sounds right. And, you know, it can be that much of a difference. Just hesitating for a tiny moment somewhere, or just taking a moment to smell, you know, a rose. And it makes the difference between a piece being boring and suddenly being life-changing. And that's something I really feel I carry through from George. But I think it's very important that so for example, when I'm teaching, I very seldom demonstrate. I don't like people to copy me. And in fact, once I saw one of my students showed me a video, and there's one moment he did a gesture, and I thought, that looks like me. And I said, where did you get that from? He said, oh, I copied you. And I was kind of horrified. And I was partly flattered, but partly horrified, because I spent most of my life trying not to look like my teachers. So, you know, when I was a student of George Hurst, I looked like George Hurst. When I was a student of Musin, I left looking like Musin. And I took all this time trying to make myself be myself. And that was big thanks to Colin Metters, who was my professor at the Royal Academy, and an amazing conducting teacher who I should have spoken about as well, actually, but he's just phenomenal. And
do you mean Colin Matthews, who is a composer also, right?
No, Metters, not Matthews. Metters, yeah.
Well, the one thing now to finish, it's my personal question. I want to ask, you know, I've been thinking, like, now we're all worried about health, and music is put to sort of the end of the opening line as a non-essential activity from the point of view of politics and pandemics and whatever, our biological survival. And I was saying to myself, okay, maybe it's not essential. Now I go to, say, to a house in the middle of Russia and write a book about whatever, like a new novel that I would think of from my head. And my question is to you, what would you answer to this doubts that this strange situation has posed? Why and whether is music essential now for us?
It's such a huge question. I don't think I can answer it in one line, but there's a line which immediately springs to mind, which was from Churchill, Winston Churchill, who said, I won't get the words right, but paraphrasing, he said, he was talking about the war. If we don't have arts, then what are we fighting for, or what's left? You know, it's, you know, and it's, I think it's very difficult. I mean, it's, you know, we are so privileged, those of us who live and work surrounded by beauty, by culture, by inquisitive minds, you know, and we are so lucky because there are a lot of people who don't have that luxury. Their whole lives are spent just having to work to make enough money to survive. And you try telling somebody who has no time for themselves how the taxes should be going to the opera house. I mean, how do you convince them that that money is important compared to the fact that their children maybe haven't, you know, she doesn't have enough money to bring up her children. So all I can say is how we all know in our souls how important it is, because I think that's basically, I think it's the difference between us and animals, you know, is that animals can't sing, they can't play instruments, they can't paint, they can't appreciate art. Maybe that's a big thing. They can't appreciate art or the arts, but they just live and enjoy the moment. And you know, the arts are about so much more than enjoyment. They tell us things about what it is to be alive, and it's not just about what it is to be human. It's you know, think about Mozart, who through his music comes this belief in humanity, in the potential that ultimately humanity will be good. There is goodness in humanity. Other composers see it differently, and you see other sides to it. And the reason why I love opera is that you see, hopefully we'll never be in a situation as bad as you see on the stage, but you see the people on stage going through emotions which matter to us, which speak to us. They enable us to feel not alone, and they help us understand ourselves. And for anyone who's played, you know, a simple piece of music on the piano and closed their eyes while they're playing it and just let that sound world be the whole universe, you know that you're experiencing something really special. And if you lose that, then you end up with an existence which is based around money and success and doesn't have any space for beauty.
And food maybe.
And food maybe. But even then, I mean, food, I mean, it's a good point. I mean, see, so I love cooking, for example, but I love cooking not just because it's food, but because I love seeing the way one ingredient with another ingredient creates a fusion and you know, how things work together. I mean, cooking and conducting are so similar. But in a sense, you know, cooking, you know, you know, I mean, the word for conductor is chef d'orchestre, chef, you know, and it's all, there's such similarity. And, you know, we are taking basic ingredients, you know, a note is a basic ingredient, but when you mix it with the other notes or the other ingredients, you create a beautiful cake or a wonderful piece of music.
Well, if you care, 1 minute question. Why Evgeny Onegin? Because it's also one of my favorite operas, but I thought it's because I have this lyrical Russian soul and can't resist all those passages of Tatiana and so on. But why it is for you?
Why Onegin? Because I find that I love the people in it. I love Tatiana, especially. I think she's my favorite personality in all opera. And the melancholy, I mean, just from the first note, there's a melancholy which touches me very deeply. I mean, I have a melancholic streak, which sometimes I deal with better than other times, and the music of Tchaikovsky just is so open about that. And at the same time, there's such joy And you go through a whole, and when you go through Tatiana's life, from her early discoveries of love or infatuation, you know, there's a adolescence through much later on to putting duty ahead of emotion, all those things which are so true for most of us at some point. Above all, I just love the music, and the music is just perfect.
Well,
I don't know what else to say. I just love the music so much.
I fully agree. Well, thank you for everyone, to everyone, firstly to you, Toby, for your patience, and to everyone who actually reconnected with us. This will go in history as a 5-part interview, but it was so exciting, and I didn't want to stop it. And I have saved all these parts on my Instagram, so I'm not sure how to connect them, but they will just remain. Well, greetings from St. Petersburg. Can you say this project is in Moscow or St. Petersburg or in some other city?
Neither. Neither. But as soon as
Yes,
I'm allowed to tell you news,
yeah.
I will share it with you.
Actually, I've been a bit snobistic asking whether it's Moscow and St. Petersburg because there are so many other cities. Yes.
Yeah. Well, hopefully I would, you know what, I would love to come back to St. Petersburg. You know, last time I came to St. Petersburg, I had a bad experience when I got stopped by the police. You know, because I loved living there when I was a student, and then I came back to do some concerts, which I also absolutely loved. And then I came back as a tourist, and I got stopped by the police, who basically told me I needed a license for my mobile phone, which of course was nonsense. And I had to, in the end, tell them, I had to pay them a bribe, basically. And in the end, and I managed to haggle them down by telling them I would speak to my friend, the British ambassador, who I didn't know, but I pretended I did, and they started getting worried. And in the end, it went down from sort of $200 to 10 or 40 or something. But it still left me feeling so unhappy. So I haven't actually been back since, but I would love to come back. So hopefully I'll see St. Petersburg.
If you do, I promise a guided tour of Pushkin, because that's where I live. You know, Pushkin,
yes,
Tsarskoye Selo. So I've now in the pandemic, that's the only place where I've been walking. So now I'm a specialist of Pushkin and Tsarskoye Selo. So yes,
wonderful.
please do come. Well, thank you so much, and sorry for taking too much of your time, but I hope it has been a good connection in the lockdown times.
It's been lovely. Thank you so much. It's been I've really enjoyed spending the evening with you.
Спасибо вам большое еще раз.
Пожалуйста.
Сохраняю эту часть тоже.
Спасибо большое. До свидания.
Все, спасибо.